So I need to make a confession this morning, and the confession is this: Ezekiel is not a minor prophet. And I know that some of you came this morning and you have been gearing up all week to hear from Nahum or Obadiah, and I'm sorry. We're in Ezekiel. And I feel like I need to make the confession and I need to get your forgiveness. But in my defense, Ezekiel, it's not Isaiah, so it's not the prophet that everybody actually reads. And it's filled with all kinds of weird stuff, and it's like 48 chapters long, which is way longer than the other minor prophets, so that might even make it less likely that we read it. So I feel like maybe, in the spirit of kind of turning to these books that we don't cover very often, maybe Ezekiel kind of fits the bill. Okay, will you forgive me? Okay, thank you. Great. Back in the summer of 2012, my family took a vacation to Maine. We stayed in this house on the coast of Maine, just outside of Acadia National Park. It's a beautiful house, right on the water. They had kayaks where you could kind of go out and kayak around this little cove, and there were seals diving around, and just an incredible place. And it was this huge house. So it wasn't just my family, which at the time was my parents, my sister and her husband, and me and my wife, who'd been married for just over a year. No grandkids in the picture at this point. So there's the 6 of us, but we invited some family friends from Maine, and they were there. Some friends of mine from seminary who were living in Boston came up to visit. There was a bunch of us. It was an incredible time. Well, one morning, we decided, we're situated right outside of Acadia National Park, so what are we going to do? We're going to go for a hike. That's what you do when you're near a national park. But if you've been to a national park lately, you'll know that the national parks are, in general, just kind of overrun. And so the problem with going to do this hike was parking. There was enough of us that we had to go in 2 cars, and the hike that we wanted to do, there's not a lot of parking there, and so we were a little bit worried about it, but we set off in faith, hoping that we'd be able to get this thing done. And so we arrived. And my memory is that at this place in Acadia where we were trying to do this hike, is that the parking was just in this kind of like loop. And there was spots kind of all around the outside of this loop, and kind of an information center over here. But basically, there's just those parking spaces, and if you don't get one, you're out of luck. And we get there, and it is bumper-to-bumper traffic, right? It is everybody just following right behind each other, doing this loop, waiting, hoping that they'll see somebody who is coming out to their car, and you can do the kind of the look, the nod, you're leaving, okay. Hoping that you can get their space when they leave. So it doesn't look good, but we get into our line doing the loop, and of course, the car that my dad's driving, first time around, they get a space. It's just how it always worked out for my dad. My dad was lucky like that somehow. Not so much my car. My friend Scott's driving. We do our loop. We see them park. There is nothing for us. So we do another loop. And we do a second loop. And as we're doing the third loop, we're starting to discuss what our options are. Maybe we go do something else that day. Maybe we just make our own spot. We'll find a piece of grass that looks likely, and we'll just kind of park there and see what happens. We're trying to figure out what to do. When as we come around the bend back to where my dad has parked, I see my dad standing in a parking space, just going, Dude, he's doing right. He's going crazy because God has done a miracle. God has given us a parking space. And we park the car, we get out, we go to do our hike, and the whole way on this hike, my dad is not stopping, letting us know that God did this miracle for us as a favor to him. Have you ever felt like you were favored by God? Like things just worked out for you. like God was on your side, and so good things were going to come. And in fact, maybe nothing really bad could ever happen, right? It's not that nothing that was difficult would come, but if something difficult came, it would only be a test, a preparation, the thing you had to get through on your way to something that was really, really good on the other side. Have you ever felt favored by God? Now, I know that for some of you, the answer to that question is probably no. And that's okay. Hang on. I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk to you in a minute. But I think that some of you in the room know what I'm talking about. You've had that sense almost of invincibility because God had your back. And I know that I'm projecting here, but I imagine that at times in the Old Testament, Israel must have felt something similar. I can only imagine that after you go through something like the Exodus, after God parts the Red Sea and brings you through, after you have been threatened a number of different times by enemies, and God has always shown up and saved you, after you've faced drought and famine, and God has always eventually showed up and set things right, you must have this sense that it's not that nothing difficult will ever happen. It's not that God won't discipline. It's not that we won't be tested. But ultimately, in the end, nothing truly bad can happen. And I imagine that Israel felt this way right up until God abandoned them. You see, the book of Ezekiel, it's filled with visions, but it begins with this particular vision that, frankly, is one of the wildest visions in the whole of the Bible. In this vision, Ezekiel sees this storm, and this storm is kind of coming towards him. And this storm, there is thunder and there is lightning, and this storm cloud seems to be almost a flame, as if there is a fire at the center of it. And Ezekiel looks into this storm and he sees these creatures with 4 faces, depending on where you're at in the book, right? One that looks like a human, a person, one that looks like an ox, right? Different animal faces facing 4 different directions. And they have 4 wings. 2 of those wings are covering their eyes. 2 of the wings they're being used to fly. And these creatures beside them, or maybe it is them, or it's a little bit unclear, but beside them there are these wheels. And it's not just a wheel, but wheels within wheels. And by the way, those wheels are covered in eyeballs. And on top of that, sort of over the top of that is this kind of platform. And on this platform is a throne, and there is someone seated on that throne, and that one glows like fire. And I think you can start to guess what we might be seeing in this vision, right? There are lots of things happening in this vision that we don't understand. Why the eyeballs? I don't know. We're told that the creatures, when they move, because they've got 4 faces, I guess, they move like they don't turn. They don't need to turn, right? There's no face that needs to go the other direction. Why are we told that detail? I don't know. But here's what we do know, because we're told at the end of the vision. What Ezekiel is seeing in this moment is the look of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Ezekiel is seeing a vision of God's glory, God's presence, God's favor for Israel. But if you have read the book of Ezekiel, you know that this vision is not a reassuring vision, and that Ezekiel's message that he is given is not a reassuring message at this moment. And so we watch by the end of chapter 10 in Ezekiel as this vision takes this kind of chilling turn, where Ezekiel sees God's favor, God's presence resting on the temple, but we watch as that favor that presence, picks up and leaves. God's favor, God's presence, God's glory, God's protection of Israel walks away. And so whatever it has meant for Israel to be favored by God, it doesn't mean that anymore, or at least it seems that way. And so we should not be all that surprised that a few chapters later, Ezekiel, who is already in exile, who is sitting in Babylon as he sees these visions, that there a messenger, a refugee, comes and delivers the news. Jerusalem has been destroyed. The bad thing that we were going through wasn't just a test. It's over. Jerusalem is gone. Around the time of that vacation in 2012, my dad and I would have this sort of reoccurring conversation. And it felt like we'd have it about once a year because my dad was in the habit at that time of reading through the Bible every year. And so he would, at some point in the year, he'd hit Proverbs probably, and we'd have this conversation that would go something like this. My dad would say, it sure seems like God has just really blessed us and blessed me. The business is doing really well. My family is happy and healthy. I'm so proud of you all. I don't know how to explain it, except maybe God has just blessed us because we have been faithful. And then I would say something like, okay, I see what you're saying, but just take that logic and flip it. What if next year the business doesn't have a great year? What about people for whom things are not going quite so well? If God is specifically blessing you here, is God specifically cursing them there? We start to get into this kind of problematic territory, and my dad would kind of end the argument the way he often ended an argument, which is to just kind of brush you off. And he would just kind of grin, and he'd say, yeah, but I know that all these good things are not due to me. It just seems like God has blessed us. And then, just about exactly a year after that vacation, he died. And it felt like I watched as God's favor, God's glory, God's presence and blessing in our life packed its things and took off. And I'm preaching this message this morning because I think that there are some of you who have lived that same moment. That moment when it sure seems as though God's favor has simply abandoned you. You have been in a hospital room or a doctor's office, and you have heard someone say there are no more treatment options. You've been called into your boss's office and been told that you're no longer needed. You've gotten a phone call, and the phone call is not something bad might be happening, but it already happened. If God was going to step in and do something, he had the chance, and he didn't. It's already over. Some of you have lived this moment, and when you live it, it divides your life in half. There is the life that you had, and then the one that you have now. Or really, there is the life that you had, which was actually a life. And then there is the wreckage that you have now. All of which brings us to Ezekiel 37. As Pastor Steve might say, I've been talking for 15 minutes or something, and I haven't even started preaching yet. So I suppose we might as well turn to the actual passage for the day. In this passage, Ezekiel is brought by the Spirit to the valley of dry bones. And it's almost like the Spirit kind of gives him a tour, just takes him around the valley and says, just take a look. What do you see? And what he sees is just a pile of bones that are dried up and scattered. We're told later on that what he's looking at is Israel. Israel dead. Not just dead, but long dead. Not just long dead, but long dead and not even buried. Maybe not remembered. Well past the point of hope. Israel in this vision is not just dead, but forgotten, not cared for. And in this moment, God asked the prophet really the only question that matters. Can these bones live again? I think that there are some of you here this morning who find yourself in the story, in the vision, somewhere close to the prophet. Which is to say that you are not yourself this morning, living in the valley of dry bones. You are perhaps observing it in the life of someone around you. Maybe you've never had this experience of being in the valley. Or maybe for you that experience has been long ago and you've come through it. But you see this experience playing out in the life of someone around you, someone that you love. And so the question that you are asking is the same question that the Lord asks the prophet. Can these bones live again? And in the text, the prophet gives maybe the best answer there is. Lord, you are the one who knows. I can't say yes, because that just doesn't seem likely given the situation. But I also know I can't say no, because where God is involved, all things are possible. And so the prophet simply says, God, you are the one who knows. And so then we watch as God does what God has been doing since the very beginning. You see, Ezekiel 37 is a recapitulation, a redo, a playing out again of what God did in Genesis 1 and 2, but in that time and in that place. The answer to the question, can these bones live, is of course they can, because God is the God who brings life, simply because of who God is. But there is a really important difference in this passage compared to Genesis 1 and 2. And the difference is that while God brings life by simply speaking it into being once again, here, God speaks those words using the prophet's mouth. So, if you are someone who is not now in the valley, the word of the Lord for you today is, yes, these bones can live again, and you are invited to speak words of life that bring resurrection. You might be able to be involved in this work that God is doing. Here's the caution, though, and I think that this is important. Because Ezekiel, in this vision, stands apart from the bones, but we know that in reality, he's one of them. He's there with them. Ezekiel just is one of Israel. He is one of those down in the valley with them. Ezekiel has watched as God's favor departed and seemed to abandon Israel, and Ezekiel must have shared those same questions, that same confusion, that same, maybe, despair that Israel is feeling in the valley. It is easy when people around us walk through the worst moments of their life. It is easy to stand apart and kind of throw words of encouragement at them. It's almost a defense mechanism, right? It's a way of making sure you don't have to get too close, that you don't have to look too hard at what happened to them so you don't have to think about it happening to you. But I can tell you from experience, those kinds of words don't do a whole lot. But there were a few in that year or two after my father died. A few who I knew had been there, who were able to enter into that experience with me, who understood what it felt like and what it meant. There were a few who, when they spoke, it was almost like, not almost, it was the Spirit of God speaking through them. I have never felt God speak to me more powerfully and more clearly than in those years after my dad's death, in just a couple instances when someone joined me in the valley and spoke words of life to me anyway. So that's the caution. You are invited, you are called to speak words of resurrection, but only if you can join them in the valley. And unfortunately, the way most of us are able to do that is by walking through the valley ourselves. Okay, back to the text. Ezekiel, the prophet, asks the question, and God says, I'll answer your question by just showing you. And he invites the prophet to prophesy to the bones, and the prophet does. And we watch along with Ezekiel as God does what he did in Genesis. God in Genesis gathers up the dust and the clay and forms it into a body. And here in Ezekiel 37, God gathers up the bones, and we see them, they join end to end, and they become a skeleton again, the beginnings of a person. And then we watch as sinews join those bones together, and as flesh covers them, and as they begin to move back towards life. Like I said, I think that some of you are in the middle of the valley right now. You are someone who says what Israel is saying in this passage. The only words we hear from the bones from Israel is, our bones are dry, our hope is lost, we are cut off. And so for some of you this morning, you look around and what you see around you is not your life. It is just the bones of a life that you used to have. I want you to notice a couple of things in this passage this morning. First thing I want you to notice, in this passage, in this vision, in this moment, it doesn't matter a whole lot how the bones got where they are. There are other parts of Ezekiel where there is plenty of blame to go around, where God makes it clear that what has happened is a result of Israel's unfaithfulness and sin. But in this moment, that doesn't seem to matter very much. And in fact, I think it's worth pointing out, Ezekiel himself, who is experiencing the valley moment, who has gone into exile, he's probably only 25 or so when he's carried off into exile. Young enough that I think it's fair to say that exile happened to him a lot more than it's fair to say that he earned exile somehow. And so I think that it's fair to suppose that there are plenty of those in the valley who didn't earn what happened to them. But regardless, whether they put themselves there or they didn't, that's not what this story is about. That's not what this vision is focused on. It doesn't matter very much in that moment. What matters here is not so much that Israel is sinful. It matters that Israel suffers. It matters that Israel needs life and resurrection, and that God is the kind of God who provides it. So what I want you to hear this morning, if you are in the valley, is you do not need to spend your time wondering how you got yourself there. You need only look to the Lord who wants to bring new life. Second thing I want you to notice, there is no pretending in this vision that things are really not so bad. One commentator that I read actually said that the Hebrew here, those lines from Israel, it has this kind of cadence, this rhythm. It is 3 sets of 2 words that have this pattern to them that sound almost like a song, a funeral song. Israel is here singing their own funeral dirge. There is no pretending that they have not really died, that this is only a stepping stone on the way to some great glory. There is an acknowledgement, a naming of the death and the loss. So if you are in the valley, the second thing I want you to hear this morning is that you need not pretend that you have not lost, that you do not grieve, that things are really not so bad. Name it. If you need to, sing your loss. Pretending will help no one. The third thing that I want you to notice in this passage is that as much as it feels like it, you have not, in fact, been abandoned. Now, I know I told you that in those first 10 chapters of Ezekiel, this vision, we see God's presence and favor and glory rise up from the temple and leave. And that is a remarkable thing. But what is most remarkable about that vision is not that God's favor leaves. He's been telling Israel for hundreds of years at this point what would happen if they could not obey. What's remarkable is that when God's presence and God's favor leaves the temple, it heads east. Specifically, to follow Israel into exile. God's favor is shown here in the vision to have wheels because it will travel with you into the valley. So while God's favor may not rest on the temple any longer, it is with you. The first time Ezekiel sees this vision, he is sitting on the banks of Babylon, of a river in Babylon, and he sees the glory and presence and favor of God coming to him there. So, if you are in the valley, you have not actually been abandoned, though I know it feels that way. And finally, what I want you to see in this passage is that death with God is not actually the end of hope. We see in the vision how God, acting through God's people, just knits these bones back together into a semblance of life again. And so if you are in the valley, I invite you to look to the people of God and how God is working through them to gather up and knit back together and hold together the pieces of your life. Because God is faithful, and through his people, he will do it. But this isn't actually the end of the vision yet. Because just like in Genesis, God brings life kind of in 2 stages, right? God forms the body, but that is not yet life until there is breath, until the Spirit of God has filled them. And so I think that there are probably some of you in the room this morning who have been through the valley, and you are not now just a pile of dried up bones. If we looked at your life, right, physically, materially, things look like life once again. You have all the things that you need. You have stuff to be doing. You have friends and relationships. Externally, you look like you are through the other side. And yet, that breath, the wind of God has not yet refilled your sails. Something in you knows that you have not yet come alive again. And so to you, I simply say what God says to Israel here. God will put his breath in you. You shall live. He will set you on your own soil, and you will know that the Lord has spoken and has done it. You don't have to settle for a kind of half life. God is interested in bringing you back to the goodness and fullness of life that he has for you. I invite you, what you need in this moment, I think, is you need to hear God speaking. You need God to say to you, because no one else can. You need God to say to you, you are not alone. You are not abandoned. This is not the end for you. I still love you and favor you, and I am still with you. Life can still be good, and it is headed towards something better. But the way that God most often chooses to speak those words is through the prophet, through his people. So if that's you this morning, I invite you to turn your attention to the people of God, to the world that God has created. In the vision, it is just the winds from the four corners of the earth that bring this new life. Turn to those places where God has chosen to speak and listen for his voice there. In the last couple years of his life, one of my dad's favorite sayings was a Keith Jury original. Or I thought maybe it was actually Keith Jury's dad or something, but I heard it from Keith. It was, get under the spout where the grace comes out. And it meant that there are places where God tends to work, where God tends to move. So if you need some grace, if you need God to move, you need God to speak, go to those places where he tends to show up. If you are someone who needs that breath, that wind of God to fill you again, that is my invitation to you. I have one more confession for you this morning. And the confession is, I wish I could tell you that after you go through the valley of dry bones, you can have all of the things, all of the confidence, all of the sense that things will work out for you that you had once upon a time. Unfortunately, I think that that's just not the case. Once that sense of invincibility is gone, I don't think that it comes. I'll say it this way. It's been 10 years this summer for me, and I've never quite gotten that back. But what I will say is that God's favor remains. Life can still be good and filled with unexpected gifts of grace.